Good morning, everyone. As Cooper so lovely just introduced me, I host a podcast called Back from the Borderline, and I spend a lot of my time critically examining exactly how our ordinary human struggles are rebranded as disorders and how that framing shapes the stories that people tell about their own minds. And I just want to say thank you to this morning's panelists, because you all did such an amazing job of really talking about what brought us here to this moment. And now we all have a much better idea about how these certain ideas took root and played a part in the systems that we're all living in right now. And many of you are being negatively impacted by those systems. But now we get to talk about what all of that actually means on the ground and just how these ideas filter into daily life, especially for children, and what unfolds systemically when distress gets interpreted through a pathologizing or medicalized lens. And when I was preparing for this panel, admittedly very neurotically and nervously, I'm a little bit shaky. I usually record in my little hermit hole on my podcast, but I kept coming back to this line from one of my favorite philosophers, Jiddu Krishnamurti, and he spent his entire life studying just how societies shape us into who we eventually become. And he said, it's no measure of health to be well-adjusted to a profoundly sick society. And when I think about kids, this line feels almost literal. Children respond to the world as it is, not as we pretend that it is. They haven't been trained out of their instincts yet by learning to mask and minimize things away, so their reactions tend to reveal truths that us adults will overlook or dismiss. And I'm gonna try not to cry, but it's my first time being away from my baby daughter, and motherhood has really changed how I think about this. I was interviewing Bob Whitaker when I was still pregnant, and so it's just crazy how far we've come since then. And she just turned 1, and I'm just struck every day by how quickly children start to form that profoundly foundational sense of I am. And they get that from the cues of their parents and the many, many authority figures around them. And when a child is told that their frustration and their sadness is somehow evidence of disorder or dysfunction, it reaches into that almost numinous early identity formation process in really destructive ways, as we think, as all of us here know. And I came across this framework in my early 20s, right? And that was bad enough, but many people encounter it much, much earlier than that. And the younger this stuff begins, the deeper the imprint it leaves behind is. So our conversation now is about what happens when that ordinary work of growing up and all that intensity and confusion and rebellion gets rerouted through a clinical vocabulary, and what it means for a generation to form a sense of self inside that story. So I'm joined by 3 people here on this stage who have examined all of this from very different angles, and Cooper did a brilliant job of introducing them, so we don't need to do that. But I'm really glad all of you are here, and I'd like to start off with something grounded in daily reality. So when you look at childhood today in schools and clinics and through lived experience, what does medicalization of children actually look like on the ground? So Gretchen, I'm gonna start with you.
Okay. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about a piece of the world that's called Hampton Roads. It's the southeastern corner of Virginia. You probably haven't heard of it, but it includes the cities of Virginia Beach and Norfolk and a few other cities that you may have heard of. And that place just happens to have been the nation's first ADHD hotspot, meaning the first place where ADHD diagnoses really spiked high. And I'm going to tell you what happened there. It was 1993, and the region's pediatric hospital decided to recruit 2 pediatric specialists to the region who had expertise in ADHD to open a diagnostic center. And they arrived and quickly began diagnosing a lot of children with ADHD. And then the community doctors and mental health professionals emulated their practice. By 2000, 19% of the elementary school children in the region had been diagnosed with ADHD. That was just off the charts. It's not totally off the charts today, but it was then. And they weren't just diagnosed, they were medicated, and many were heavily medicated. Among the children who were ADHD medicated, 28% were on 2 psychotropics simultaneously, 8% were on 3 or more psychotropics, and 1% were on 4 or more psychotropics. And we also found from looking at an entire school district that children who were young for their grade were 23 times more likely than their peers to be medicated for ADHD. And the effect on the kids was not great. So that kind of severe ADHD overtreatment should have been halted, but instead it has morphed into a national disaster, really. Now we have many communities around the U.S. that have prevalence rates on par with what we found in Hampton Roads, Virginia, a quarter of a century ago. And among ADHD diagnosed children now, between children and young adults between 2 and 24 years of age, 40% of them are on an antipsychotic. And these, as you know, are powerfully sedating drugs that can cause weight gain, diabetes, and even permanent neurological damage. So I think when you ask what harm comes from looking at normal childhood development through the lens of psychiatry, that really speaks volumes.
Thank you, Gretchen. And Nick, actually, I think I'll go to Alan first. You've looked at this from a broader systems perspective. What are you seeing on the ground when it comes to the medicalization of children?
Well, it's a subset of the medicalization of everything. But we did a really interesting study in British Columbia almost 20 years ago. It was published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal. And what we did is we had the prescribing records of every child in British Columbia, hundreds of thousands of children in elementary school. And we looked at 2 cohorts of children. We took all the children that had been prescribed an amphetamine-like drug, a Ritalin-type ADHD drug, and we put them into 2 cohorts. The one cohort was called the early babies. It was the the babies who were born between January and June. It was the early cohort, and the other cohort was born between July and December. Okay, so often in a classroom, you'll have some older children and some younger children. And we found something quite astonishing, that the children who were born in the latter half of the year, 40% of them, they had 40% higher rates of prescribing of ADHD drugs. Which is to say, younger children who are perhaps less mature, more likely to act out, more likely to be a little naughty, are being prescribed at a much higher rate because they happen to be younger. I remember when this came out and I was interviewed by a journalist and asked me to describe what's going on here, and I said, we are medicalizing and medicating a social situation, not a medical situation. And this is wrong on so many levels. And I only point that out is because the birth month effect, the month in which you're born, should not determine whether you have a mental illness or not. Okay, so the fact that we continue to prescribe drugs at higher rates to younger children in classrooms has to say something about the way the classroom runs, not about the way the kid has a mental disorder or not. So I'm just going to put that out there.
Thank you, Alan. Nick, you've talked openly about what it was like to navigate these systems yourself as a teenager. We'd love to bring your perspective in here.
Yeah, was this working? Yeah. Well, I had a number of pretty normal things going on for me, I would say, that really looking back on it, it's really clear to me it just had to do with dysfunction in the environment of various kinds. That's how I make sense of it now. And one of them had to do with the school system, which I never agreed with, and I still don't, actually, quite frankly. I don't really think that it helps people develop the kind of skills and habits and knowledge that are a part of successful adulthood. I think it's authoritarian in a lot of ways. And I think it gets in the way of the development of a lot of really important traits in people. And then in my family system, that was kind of the other area where I was coming up against the environment and was being pathologized for it. There wasn't a lot of awareness, wasn't a lot of emotional depth, pretty dysfunctional, poor communication, that kind of thing. And it's like in each of these settings, the underlying logic is sort of like, if this doesn't work for you, then there's something fundamentally wrong with you, basically, with kind of more kind of propaganda on top of it, I would say. And so for me, the core of the damage occurred because I was feeling the stress of these things, but then there was really like no serious acknowledgement of that, no taking that seriously, but then there was coercion on top of that, and so that's kind of the core of how that happened. And the last thing I'll say just briefly is I think a lot of kids are trapped in settings that are not conducive to the development of like the whole human being, you could say. And I think very often it's kids that are, maybe they're more sensitive, they're more like emotionally attuned or something like that. And they're the ones often that are coming up against these things. And I think that kind of awareness and that kind of difference is a really cool thing, a really, really great thing. But it often doesn't fit in environments where there's not a lot of awareness and there's a lot of denial and dysfunction and things like that. And so that kind of thing gets broken down and kind of, perceived as subversive, right? And it's treated with hostility rather than valued and cultivated. So.
Thank you, Nick. So let's just go a little deeper now and look at what this actually does to young people. And I'd like to now talk about what the consequences are for children's bodies, like their sexuality and their sense of self. So, Alan, I'll start with you. What have you seen in that regard in your work?
I think I'd rather talk about steel workers. Just think of some of the toughest people working in a steel mill. Okay? These are people who are basically working in Dante's Inferno. Okay, there's a story here. In 1978, in Hamilton, Ontario, at Stelco, a big steel mill, researchers from McMaster University did a very interesting study. And what they did is they took the entire workforce and they screened some of them for hypertension. Okay, this is high blood pressure. And the people that were screened for hypertension and told that they had hypertension were compared to the group that were told that they didn't have hypertension, okay? And they followed these cohorts for a number of years, and they found something very interesting, that the people who were told that they had hypertension, absolutely identical to the other cohort, had higher rates of absenteeism, about 80% higher rates of absenteeism. In terms of identifying other factors, they looked at work satisfaction, they looked at basically happiness in life, and subsequent illness. And this is called the labeling effect. So they take these hardened steel workers and they do nothing to them except apply a label. They say, you are now a hypertensive. And that has a profound effect on the rest of their lives because they've suddenly been identified as patients. Now, okay, those are the tough people, but imagine doing that to children. A child like Cooper, when he's 12 years old, acts out in class and gets a label like, you are attention deficit disordered. And for a defenseless, vulnerable child, just imagine what applying a label does to that person for the rest of their lives. Not just their self-conception, but the way other people treat them. I'm putting this out there just to say that labels are actually more dangerous than the drugs themselves. When you apply a label and do nothing, as we saw with steel workers in Hamilton in 1978, you're damaging people, okay? You do it to children, I would consider that a form of child abuse.
Precisely. I have to admit, I was like, where's the steelworker thing going? But it was really, it's such a profound point, right? And just, I think so many of us who have tried to seek out these labels or had them foisted upon us know the impact. As I mentioned, there's that really important philosophical and spiritual question of I am, and it's so important, and there's a reason why many ancient traditions homed in on that, and we are tampering with that for children. And so Gretchen, I've been speaking about this process of childhood being so delicate, and Alan so beautifully spoke about what that did to even hardened, adult men, right? So you're working really closely with kids in these situations. What have you seen in terms of their growth and their self-image and that identity formation process?
Well, I want to continue with the story of Hampton Roads a little bit because it hasn't really gone well. So if you think back to all of those kids who got the ADHD label, what happened within several years of that huge spike in diagnoses, the treated kids started flooding the local emergency departments and psychiatric crises. And at the same time, the police in the area were complaining about an uptick in violence among the treated kids. So what did the community do in response? It lobbied the legislators for permission and funding to build a psychiatric hospital for kids. And they finally got the green light, and they increased their number of child psychiatrists from 1 to 20. The building opened in 2022. It's a 14-story inpatient psychiatric hospital for children that looms high above the medical school complex where I once worked. And now what happens when the children show up in an emergency department in a psychiatric crisis, they get a 10 to 15-minute computerized screening consult from a psychiatrist from that facility, which usually ends in a referral to an inpatient stay at the facility, which virtually guarantees that the children will be further medicated. And I guess bad care begets more bad care if you don't stop it. And we know that the connection between psychotropics and violence is a matter of debate, but I think it's noteworthy that the first school shooting by a 6-year-old happened in 2023 in Hampton Roads. And that child had a history of violence and family troubles, but he wasn't given an opportunity to avail himself of any of the standard non-drug treatments that are available to school children. Instead, he was medicated with stimulant drugs, which are known to exacerbate aggression. And the consequences to him, the psychological impact is incalculable to him, but also to the teacher he maimed, the school principal who's facing criminal charges, his mother who's already in prison for her role in the shooting, and all the classmates who witnessed it. So to me, that just speaks to the tragedy of looking at common behavior problems through the lens of psychiatry and medicalizing childhood.
Thank you, Gretchen. That is incredibly and profoundly disturbing, and it really shows how systemic, it's like the domino effect of all of this. And Nick, when you and I spoke on my podcast, something I was really struck by is how these high control youth programs that you were involved in, they pushed you to doubt your own perceptions and almost gaslight yourself and totally disconnect from your own emotions and your very interiority, right? So maybe you could speak a little bit about how that experience impacted your own identity formation process and how you related to yourself over time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, just kind of stepping back first, I think it really is worth just underscoring that these kind of interventions do condition and shape kids in unbelievably profound and often disturbing ways. And I would add that that is true, I think, not just of this medicalization phenomenon, but also things like the programs we talked about, a lot of therapy for kids, especially when it's non-consensual, behavior modification, all these different things. They condition kids in very profound ways. And often that is a really neglected part of the discussion when these things are being sold and considered and implemented. And I think for me, the core of how it shaped me at the time was I was basically, I would say, brainwashed into thinking that so many aspects of my authentic self were just some kind of inherent biological defect, A lot of my difficult feelings, my anger, my passion, all these different parts of myself that are just a part of being human that everybody has to some degree. I was just brainwashed into thinking it was a biological defect. But I will say that I feel really grateful because I think, like you, Molly, and like a lot of people, you know, I eventually figured out that, first of all, like, all that brainwashing wasn't true, and that I could actually transcend it and heal it over time. It took a while for me to figure that out, but eventually I did, and you know, it's really possible to come from a place of a lot more well-being and empowerment, I would say.
Thank you, Nick. So let's widen the frame a little bit. We've already, Gretchen beautifully touched on it, because now I'd really like to talk about what this does to families, you know, at a more systemic level, and also our shared idea about what childhood is, right? Because as we have already discovered here just through this discourse, is that these patterns don't stop at the individual, even though that's what they home in on, right? They talk about what's wrong with you. But the way that we handle them, it all trickles through households and schools and then into entire communities. So my final question for the group is, what does this dynamic do to family systems and also our understanding of what childhood is? So Gretchen, I'll start with you.
Okay. I'm going to talk about the experience of Sue Perry, who many in this audience will know about. She's been an absolutely fierce parent advocate who isn't able to do that work anymore right now. And she became a parent advocate because of what happened to her. She was living in a upscale pressure cooker community outside Seattle, Washington, another ADHD hotspot in the 1990s, when the school system told her that her son had ADHD and really needed to go on Ritalin. And up until then, Sue and her husband, Mike, had felt like their son, Andy, and his brothers were perfectly normal. They had at least average grades in school. They had friends. The family was happy. They thought their children were normal. So they resisted the diagnosis until the school psychologist, who was determined to get the child on medication, gave the parents a glossy pamphlet that was filled with misinformation. And one of the quotes in that said, this is direct quote, "Parents should be aware that these medicines do not quote unquote drug or quote unquote alter the brain of a child. They make the child quote unquote normal." So the Perrys had their son Andy on medication for 3 years, and then Sue noticed that on the back of that pamphlet, that glossy pamphlet, there was a small logo for the drug company that made Ritalin. So Mike, her husband, wrote the school district demanding answers, and they got a letter back saying that a drug rep had given the school system thousands of these pamphlets. There was one for parents and one for educators, and that they were distributing them for free. So Mike was so distraught over being baited and seduced into medicating his normal child for ADHD that he retired early, and so the family could escape to Hawaii. Now, fortunately, Andy grew up to be a successful businessman, but Sue never really got over feeling like that diagnosis and that intrusion in her happy family life forever changed her and her family. And I think it says, you know, childhood. What is wrong with being bouncy and distractible and not getting on the adult agenda and, you know, lockstep right away? It takes time to develop, and yeah,
it does.
We've lost patience.
I think all of us had like a collective cringe when we heard that quote. And interesting, it said that it makes your child normal, but he
Right.
didn't want to medicate his normal child, because it is normal for kids to almost be the canary in the coal mine, right? If they see
Right.
something wrong, or if they don't want to do what they feel to be constrictive to them, they know what their body needs, and they need people to guide them into being more in touch with their intuition, more in touch with their feelings. And it just feels like these are numbing pipelines. Nick, something that you do really beautifully is talking about families. And you and I talked about that on the podcast, because I think with the troubled teen industry too, most people think, oh, how could a parent ever arrange for their child to be kidnapped? Nick's story is really harrowing, and we obviously don't have time to go into it, but he was forcibly taken from a hotel room, you know, and he's just a teenager. But we still found a way to have this discourse about how even Nick's own family, right, they were gaslit in their own way. And even families are looking up to these authority figures and these systems, right? And so we're not going to get anywhere by blaming parents and cutting off parents. There is a time, I'm sure, for that, but we need to talk in a more nuanced way if we're actually going to make change. So, Nick, maybe you can talk a little bit more about what this looked like in your own family to the extent that you're comfortable, right? And maybe share a little bit about what this process was like for your parents and how you've come to this, what I believe is a really nuanced view on all of this. How long did it take you to go from, that disillusionment and the anger to finding this more nuanced view of the way that this impacted your family?
Yeah, well, I'm going to tackle this in a little bit more general terms.
Sure.
I think that there's kind of like a dark sort of underbelly to this whole thing. And it's like in many families, just like in the school system, if you don't kind of conform to that environment, if you're not like sufficiently obedient, basically, there's a narrative that gets constructed that, there's something wrong with you biologically or what have you. And so I think that, like, unfortunately, there's a lot of parental vulnerability where these services can basically like sell different forms of force against the kid. And so it looks like it's mental health treatment, it's support or something like that. But at the end of the day, often that's just kind of what it is. It's like, we used to maybe use more fists or whatever, but now we use more medication, coercion, kidnapping kids, sending them to these places, things like that. And I think that in terms of what's going on for the parents, often it can be, for some, easier to hear that there's something wrong with the kid than the family system has issues, and that comes down to the unresolved issues of the parents. But I think that message, because it's probably the true message in many cases, even though it's really difficult to hear, is the more optimistic message. It's the one that leads to like genuine potential transformation and healing and that kind of thing. But it just surfaces a lot of pain that the parents don't feel prepared to deal with. And probably a lot of the mental health professionals that are selling these services don't have the level of like depth or awareness to even understand that or begin to assist parents with that. And so for me, I always just like had this voice or this perspective that was like, this is totally not right. This is ridiculous. This is definitely not the truth. And it was just like my perspective and my will versus, this culture around me where there was a lot of denial and it was just like things were really confused. There was a lot of, I would say, delusion. And, when you're a kid and you're in that kind of conflict, you're going to just lose that conflict for as long as you remain a kid, and that's just kind of the reality of it.
Thank you, Nick. So, Alan, from your view, what do you think really happens to society's understanding of childhood when it's all filtered through this lens of diagnosis and treatment?
It's very easy to hoodwink people. I mean, the damage to children is relatively obvious. What's not so obvious is that sometimes, as you mentioned, the parents demand they want the label, they want the diagnosis that gives them some level of comfort. I had a lot of fun with this. I did a radio documentary in 2003 with the CBC. They have an evening program called Ideas. And I had 2 hours, and the name of my program was called Manufacturing Patience. And that segment, the first episode started off with Paul Kennedy, who was one of the lead producers, acting as if he was an announcer on a stage announcing the results of a new clinical trial. And it sounded like a CBC radio program, or a CBC radio announcement. So he stood up and said, "Today, researchers have discovered a drug that is going to be the end of a parent's nightmare. This is a drug for a new condition that they've identified called AMDD, which stands for Adolescent Motivational Deficiency Disorder." What we used to call lazy teenagers. Now, with this drug, we've seen teenagers get off their couches, turn off their TVs, and get jobs at an unprecedented rate. That's how I started that program, kind of to demonstrate how easy it is to fool people when it comes to new conditions. Imagine if we had a drug for lazy teenagers today. That was 20 years ago. People would say, yeah, absolutely, it's about time we have a drug for lazy teenagers. The Australians, though, went a little bit further. They, 3 years later, in the inaugural conference on disease mongering in Newcastle, they took my disease and they changed it. They changed it to MODED, which stands for Motivational Deficiency Disorder. And they had, again, a researcher in a white lab coat who stood up to talk about how wonderful this pill could take basically unmotivated people and turn them into, and he says at one point, he says, Health Finder website of the United States Department of Health and Human Services reported that Indolabant, that was the name of the fake name of the drug, Indolabant is effective and well tolerated. And Leth Argos, the lead researcher, said the drug works so well, quote, one young man who could not leave his sofa is now working as an investment advisor in Sydney. So back to the point that disease mongering can fool all of us, and obviously the impact on families. You know, after my program came out, I had people emailing me and saying, I actually do have a lazy teenager. Where can I get this drug? That's enough.
Wow. Well, I think we all can agree that, you know, recovering and becoming an investment banker is just peak recovery goals. So. So before we close things out, I'd love to just give each of you a moment to leave the room with anything final words, before we kick things over to Laura and Jan. So Gretchen, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think what I've been hearing is how much we really want to create a paradigm where we start to see children as inherently well and deserving patience and guidance and support, not as inherently pathological and needing pills. And if we want to make that kind of shift, I think we have to realize it's unlikely to come from within the medical establishment. We're going to need legions of citizens, particularly parents, who will push back on the system because they're informed with accurate information about psychiatric diagnoses, labels, alternative strategies that don't involve drugs, and even prevention strategies. And so everyone here is, as far as I'm concerned, part of that growing legion.
Thank you, Gretchen. So Nick, what would you like to leave the room with?
Well, I would say that I think this kind of medicalization really limits one's awareness of their environments, and it limits any kind of really potent understanding of what's truly going on for them. And so people are being told that they have a biological problem when in many cases there's no scientific basis for that, as far as I understand. And so as kids, then we're not understanding, or we can't look back and then understand how we've been really shaped and conditioned by these things. And I think it's that kind of paradigm shift where there's really the potential for ratcheting up the human condition, I would say. And it's kind of through that process that we can recover maybe some of our inner guidance or inner compass, or however you want to look at that.
Oh, nice. You tied that right in there so nicely, Nick. Alan.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can only make two comments about kind of the movement, okay? This conference is about the future of mental health in America. And I think that I have two mottos. The first one is, if it's not fun, it's not sustainable. And so I think that we need to approach this with a sense of enthusiasm and joy, and also to look for the fun. Because I think if we have fun, this is going to keep going, and we're going to attract people. We don't want to be a bunch of dour academics sitting around, scratching our heads about what to do about the evils of society. We want to have fun.
Yes.
So that's my first point.
Agreed.
So my second point is, because I am in America, I have to quote probably the most aphoristic guy around, Yogi Berra. And this kind of ties into what David was saying about our approach has to be done with a certain amount of humility. We have to admit we don't know everything, and that there are a lot of unanswered questions. And I think one of our major criticisms of the mainstream psychiatry is they fucking think they know it all. And we don't want to become another authoritarian type approach to this. What we want is we want humility. So Yogi Berra famously said once, "It's not the heat, it's the humility." So I'd like to keep that in mind as we go forward.
That's beautifully put. You know, something that, and just to close things out, and just, you've all shared so many amazing things here, and something that came to mind as I was listening to you was how, you know, Gretchen, I think you said, you know, bad care begets bad care, something to that effect. And Nick, when we spoke, it's all about people are just following the rules, right? They're following the rules that are given to them. We are conditioned through school to be good rule followers. I know for me, I had my own daddy issues, and I wanted to impress the person that was giving me my treatment. I wanted to be a good patient, a good student. I wanted to do my homework. And so I think parents want the best for their kids, and so they go to the people that they are told, that are raised up in the media, that will help them. And when I spoke to Laura, you know, she had lots of resources available to her. Her parents poured everything into her care. I came from a pretty underprivileged background myself, and so I had the internet and hashtag content creators and hashtag stop the stigma and BPD recovery communities, and I really thought that I had found the answer, and we were all following the rules. But I think what it requires is people to stop gaslighting themselves and say, hey, this actually doesn't make sense. Things aren't getting better. And it's such an honor to be in a room full of everybody who is fighting for the same things. And what we can all do together is really powerful. I know that sounds very Hallmark cardish, but we're all doing amazing things. And I think that we can stop stuff like this from happening to kids like Nick. And so thank all three of you. Thank you to all of the panelists who presented this morning. And we'll kick things over to Laura and Jan, and I think we're a little bit ahead of schedule. So.